In the previous video on this channel, we learnt that in Hegel's philosophy, absolute knowing does not mean possessing a final or total knowledge of all facts. It is not omniscience. Rather, it names the recognition that truth is not a static object waiting to be grasped by a detached subject, but something that unfolds historically through a dialectical process. At the foundation of Hegel's understanding of the goal of philosophical thought is a critique of the idea that truth could ever be given immediately, without mediation or development. This is the immediacy of naive realism. For Hegel, the problem with pure immediacy is that it cannot function as knowledge. In the phenomenology of spirit, sense certainty presents itself as the highest and truest form of knowing, the sheer unmediated awareness of this here, this now. Sense certainty takes itself to be non-conceptual, non-mediated, and self-justifying, but as soon as it wants to articulate what it claims to know, it must rely on universals, such as this, here, and now, terms that apply across many situations, rather than naming a singular, unique given. These universals are not immediate data, but conceptual abstractions, and so the attempt to state immediacy transforms it into mediation. What sense certainty takes to be singular and self-present is, in fact, indeterminate and abstract. It cannot preserve its own claim without negating itself, and this self-negation is what propels the dialectical development of knowledge. In the science of logic, pure immediacy takes the form of pure being, which, precisely because it is utterly immediate and without any determination, proves to be indistinguishable from nothing. Because nothing can be said of it, it collapses into emptiness. Only through mediation, through the development of determinate concepts, does thought come to grasp the structure of reality. Absolute knowing is the standpoint from which spirit recognizes that there is no truth beyond its own self-unfolding. Every determination is sublated, that is, both cancelled and preserved within a larger whole. To know absolutely is to comprehend oneself as participating knowingly within the living process of self-understanding. Now, in Buddhism, a similar insight appears in the recognition that striving, when driven by grasping, cannot lead to nirvana. The mind that seeks liberation as an object to be acquired remains caught in delusion, for the very effort to grasp it perpetuates samsara, the cycle of suffering and becoming. Of course, in Mahayana Buddhism, the awakened mode of seeing is described as non-conceptual, yet it is not an epistemic immediacy opposed to mediation like the sense certainty that Hegel critiques. It is not a raw or pre-reflective given, nor a simple absence of conceptuality. Rather, it is a reflexive, self-knowing awareness, in which appearances and their empty nature are simultaneously evident. For this reason, immediate sensory presence by itself is never identified with awakening. Buddhist paths universally emphasize ethical training and analysis and discipline and slow integration, even where realization is described as sudden. Liberation is not merely found, but realized through a transformative process that reconfigures how experience is known. Accordingly, while no Buddhist would argue that liberation comes by perfecting the process of conceptualization, Buddhism cannot be understood as rejecting mediation as such. What it rejects is clinging, mistaking concepts for the reality they point to, or taking them to capture the final nature of things. Concepts are indispensable tools, but they become fetters when reified. Buddhism is not quietism, and so it agrees with Hegel that mere unexamined immediacy cannot constitute wisdom. Some schools of Buddhism do speak of Buddha nature, or Dharmakaya, as the always present ground of enlightenment, and one might object that this suggests that awakening is already fully realized and requires no genuine development. But this does not mean that wisdom is simply available in a raw, unrecognized form. Buddha nature is likened to a seed that must be sprouted. Again, to operate in the conventional world, it requires recognition, clarification, and integration along a path. Furthermore, after awakening, phenomena still appear, and activity continues. What ceases is ignorance and identification, so that the process of becoming is no longer experienced as bondage. The awakened mode of seeing is indeed non-discursive. It is not articulable in words, and not reached by reasoning, but this does not mean that awakening is a blank or undifferentiated immediacy. Buddhist traditions consistently insist that compassion and wisdom arise together with non-conceptual awareness. Once realization is present, ethical, cognitive, and perceptual mediation have become implicit, spontaneous. Mediation is no longer thematized or deliberated over, but still actively shapes how experience unfolds. In Buddhism, the conditioned process of becoming is samsara, and it is driven by ignorance and craving. Awakening is not purely the insight into the self-perpetuating nature of samsara, but freedom from the compulsion to take the process as a problem to be solved. So, while absolute knowing reconciles consciousness with mediation by recognizing mediation as the means by which reality becomes intelligible to itself, awakening releases consciousness from identifying these mediated constructions as ultimately real things. We might say that Hegel's absolute knowing and the Buddhist awakening articulate freedom from different sides of the same problem. In Hegel, freedom consists in thought's reconciliation with its own mediating activity. Spirit comes to know that mediation is not an obstacle to truth, but its very condition. Freedom, therefore, does not require the process of determination to cease, because the process is no longer experienced as a striving toward an external or final end. The process itself is the truth. Buddhism, by contrast, locates freedom in the release from compulsive striving itself, wherein we no longer cling to appearances as sources of identity and suffering. Samsara and nirvana are not two separate realms. What changes is not the process of experience, but the mode of participation in it. Both articulate a kind of wholeness, but absolute knowing is wholeness from the perspective of thought itself, as the transparent intelligibility of process, while awakening is wholeness from the perspective of experience, as non-attachment. Both converge on the insight that striving for a fixed final truth is futile, and in both cases, consciousness discovers that its attempt to find something permanent, whether in the form of absolute knowledge, happiness, or a stable identity, collapses under its own weight. For Hegel, this collapse is a revelation in thought. The failure of finite striving discloses that truth does not lie in an object standing over and against consciousness, but in the self-comprehending movement of itself. Absolute knowing is the standpoint of speculative thought in which what is known is no longer taken as independent of the activity of knowing, and thought recognizes itself in its object. For Buddhism, the same collapse of finite striving reveals the emptiness of the framework that gives rise to striving. Thus, from a Buddhist perspective, absolute knowing could serve as both the last barrier and the doorway to liberation. At the end of the dialectical process, immediacy returns to itself as mediated immediacy, not the naive given of sense certainty, but an immediacy that has passed through its own negation and come back transformed. Absolute knowing is immediate because it does not stand in a duality with its object, but it is still rational insofar as this immediacy is the result of reason knowing itself. From a Buddhist perspective, this could be thought of as illusion knowing itself as illusion, but now as an illusion that has become inseparable from reality. Hence, it is the pinnacle of conventional truth. Again, in Hegel's account, consciousness begins as finite and internally divided. It seeks an external truth, something standing over and against it, but every such attempt reveals that what it seeks is already shaped by its own activity. Gradually, consciousness comes to see that its striving for a final, fixed truth is itself a movement within a larger self-mediating process. Indeed, what consciousness is really striving for is the absence of there being anything to strive for, or rather, that its sense of incompleteness is the truth underlying its search. And in Buddhism, the grasping mind cannot reach peace because its very grasping generates disturbance. The ego's attempt to attain liberation reinforces the delusion it seeks to overcome. The reason that Hegel is interested in the fact that we can come to know ourselves on the conventional level, as the process of mediation, while Buddhism is interested in disidentifying with that process, is obviously that they are doing entirely different things. Buddhism seeks the cessation of suffering. Hegel seeks the justification and comprehension of conventional truth. From the Buddhist standpoint, attachment to conceptualization obscures the spontaneous clarity of awareness. From Hegel's standpoint, conceptual comprehension is what makes truth and knowledge possible at all. This is a difference of two distinct projects, soteriology on the one hand and systematic philosophy on the other. We should therefore find it of extreme interest that despite their totally different aims, both culminate in a mode of ethical and intellectual behaviour that becomes self-directed, transparent, or spontaneous, rather than governed by external rules. And moreover, both dissolve duality, whether by showing that subject and object are moments within the self-knowing movement of spirit, something not entirely unfamiliar to the more affirmative Buddhist traditions such as Dzogchen or Zen, or by showing that both are empty of inherent existence and arise dependently. Speaking analogically, for Hegel there is no outside, and for Buddhism there is no inside. In both cases, there is only the surface of appearing, no deeper ground to chase beyond what is already present. Depending on whether one considers reality from the perspective of self-transparent reason or from direct experience, the intelligibility of reality is naturally going to be articulated in different ways, and this might explain the divergence between what Hegel calls spirit and what Mahayana Buddhism calls emptiness or suchness. Spirit is not a metaphysical substance alongside appearances, but the name for reality insofar as it is intelligible to itself through thought that has become fully coherent with its own mediation. Suchness, by contrast, is what remains from the standpoint of Buddhist practice when all views, including correct ones, are released. So, again, analogically speaking, spirit and suchness function as mirror images across the distinction between the relative and the ultimate. Spirit names the relative or conventional fully comprehended as such, reality as it must appear when intelligibility has become completely transparent to itself. Suchness names the ultimate insofar as it is precisely the non-ultimacy of any appearing structure, reality freed from any claim to final grounding. What appears as completion from the side of thought can appear as release from the side of practice. I don't think there is any unbridgeable incompatibility between Hegel's explanation of how reality must appear to thought when thought is fully reflective of itself, and Buddhism's explanation of what reality is when thought no longer mistakes self-comprehension for enlightenment. Spirit and suchness describe two different aspects of a single appearing reality. Whatever appears necessarily appears as structured and intelligible. This intelligibility is not an optional overlay imposed by the mind, but a condition of appearance as such. For Hegel, this necessity is named spirit, the claim that what is, insofar as it appears at all, is internally articulated, lawful, and capable of being comprehended. Intelligibility belongs to the way appearance appears, which is also inseparable from the development of rational thought, since subject and object are one. This means that intelligibility is not something that can be discarded once awakening occurs, but is a necessary condition for awakening to have any meaning, and to be embodiable within a shared world. Conceptual mediation is not the essence of liberation, but without it, liberation would not be expressible as a form of living. Reality can have a practical direction, or telos, without having an underlying purpose or ground. The development of self-intelligibility and mediation can be understood as what reality does at the level of appearance, even though it doesn't describe its ultimate nature, which is freedom. Conventionally, there is purpose and meaning to all this, but we are not ultimately bound to it. The conventional purpose of life is to disclose the contingency of the conventional purpose of life, which is equivalent to the self-realization that all appearing is freedom appearing. Reality is absent of intrinsic existence, and reality appears intelligibly. Buddhism gives the most developed account of reality's groundlessness, and Hegel gives the most developed account of reality's self-relating rationality. The conventional mind can reconcile with intelligibility while also releasing from any desire to take intelligibility as an ultimate ground for self or world. Awakening may be non-conceptual for reflective consciousness, but what makes it liberation, rather than blank immediacy, is that it is practical and intelligible, and that it functions. True knowing is not opposed to immediacy. It is immediacy that has become true, immediacy that is no longer opposed to mediation, and which can therefore recognize itself as containing its own mediation. It is mediated immediacy. The awakened state is non-conceptual for consciousness, but it is conceptual in its actuality, practicality, and intelligibility. It is immediacy so thoroughly permeated by mediation that mediation no longer appears. It has become transparent.